They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole.
Get
we found.
ready. It's time again to venture down the rabbit hole into the world of cybersecurity. You're plugged into the podcast for security leaders and practitioners with a business sense. Prepare for unique interviews, insights, and practical advice that makes your job just a bit easier. And now, please welcome your guides on this adventure, James Jardine and the White Rabbit, Rafal James.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole, friends and colleagues, to another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raf, and I want to welcome you into the show with my friend James over there.
Raf, let me tell you something from talking before we started recording. I don't want to say whether there will or will not be, but I was kind of getting my hopes up for a guitar smash in this episode.
I'm kind of hoping for a good old-fashioned 80s hair metal guitar smash.
Yeah, no guarantee.
We're not saying it's going to happen.
Well, we're not saying it's not going to happen. I don't know.
Well, before we
have to watch and see.
Before we get too far into this, just let you guys know, I think a bunch of you guys have found the YouTube channel on the DtSR Podcast Twitter page, Twitter handle. There's some videos there. This one will go there pending any digital disasters. And you guys know there's a LinkedIn page as well. A lot of you guys have found that. Look out for the streaming thing. We're going to be doing next side project on LinkedIn Live. But in this episode, appropriately titled Chips and Salsa, James, I kind of wish we probably should have some chips and salsa, but I flubbed on that.
I know. This is where you need to go back and edit and throw salsa patterns on the screen.
The LeBron James.
Where's the sound effects? Yeah, we need sound effects for this, but I'm not going to lie to you. I was in meetings since noon, and so one of my meetings, the Zoom background, somebody had pepperoni pizza, and I was like, this is, that's great for you at breakfast time. It's lunchtime for me. It's horrible. And so now I haven't eaten yet, and it's still chips and salsa. I don't know, man. I'm just, I'm getting hungry.
All right. Well, before we get too far into this episode, I want to welcome to the show Kim Lewandowski. And a little background for you guys. I get ideas for this show every once in a while as things scroll by on Twitter. A lot of you all have been thinking about third-party risk and supply chain issues and the 50-gallon pail of crap that tends to bring with you. And so I brought Kim on. She's at Google. I'll let her tell you guys a little bit about herself, and then we'll roll. Kim,
Sure.
Welcome.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I am a product manager at Google. I've been at Google for a little over 7 years
That's
now.
100 years in security years.
It is a long time. More on that in a little bit. So most of my career at Google was spent at Google Cloud, building enterprise products and working on several things there. And then 3 or so years ago, I went and worked on our cloud continuous integration, continuous delivery team. So started working on and shipped an open source platform called Tekton for CI/CD. It's Kubernetes based, and it's kind of like a Lego things you put together building blocks to build out a CI/CD system.
Cool.
And then about, I guess, time is so messed up in my head right now. I don't know, a year or 2 years ago, I kind of made the shift to security. And that's where I joined a team at Google just to protect Google from open source security and the risk involved there. Google consumes and produces a lot of open source software. So we spun up a team and have been building a lot of cool projects also, which we're here to talk about today, is something that we shipped. And yeah, so thanks again for having me. And I think if I smash that guitar, I might not have a place to sleep tonight. It's my husband's. I joke and I tell people it's his ukulele because I know nothing about guitars.
But you're at Google. There's nap pods and stuff, right?
Yeah, I haven't seen The Office in a while, but
so it's empty. So there's plenty of space.
I like how James is just
rooting for the guitar smash. That's all.
All All right, so Kim, let's start off with that's a great background. Let's start off with SLSA, Slsa. What is it, and like what do you get? Because this is a really good topic.
Yeah. Sure. So Slsa is how we pronounce it. It stands for supply chain levels for software artifacts.
Okay.
Supply chain levels for software artifact. It was originally, I originally named it security levels for software artifacts, but we got some feedback that it wasn't quite accurate in terms of what we're trying to do with the framework. So I backronymed it into supply chain levels for software artifacts. So there's actually, it's interesting you say salsa for chips, because there was a debate in our repo recently. Is this salsa, for eating, or is this like salsa dancing? So we can touch more on that later too.
Dancing for y'all. That's all I'm saying.
No, but there's a pretty epic logo now for salsa that maybe we can look at, or you can throw it up.
I'm gonna have to go find it.
Yeah. So anyway, so Slsa is inspired by what we do internally at Google. We have something internally. I don't know if the acronym doesn't matter, but anyways, to help with supply chain integrity with our internal systems. So protecting against things like insider risk and whatnot. But when you look at, vendored software that we're bringing into Google, or open source software, it's kind of like the wild, wild west out there today. And you literally have no idea how these things are sort of built and who's involved and what changes, or if I'm getting the version that I think that I'm getting with software. And developers are just sort of taking anything off the streets and putting it in their production system.
No.
Yeah. And so I actually started thinking about something similar to Slsa when I was working on that Tecton project that I had mentioned, just the implementation of the supply chain pieces. And then, it kind of expanded in scope, and we got it out the door, I guess, I don't know, several months ago. But what it is it's a framework for supply chain integrity. And so it is a very new project, and we're developing it within the Open Source Security Foundation. I think there's a number of companies that are involved now. We have a steering committee made up of, I think, 7 folks from various backgrounds and various companies. And what we're trying to do is really get on the same page about, supply chain integrity. So knowing where sort of an artifact came from, what build scripts were used, what parameters were used in that build, and really give us sort of a common language and things to talk about these things. Okay. I think, one of the...
Go ahead. I'm interested because you're talking about this. And when I thought of, as most security people do, when we think about anything that's released in terms of integrity and security, we're thinking, all right, how does a tool work? And you're talking framework rather than something that plugs code into.
Yeah. So right now, it's a framework, so we can start talking about these things in sort of a common language. And specifically, it's broken out into levels. So Slsa 1 is Slsa level 1, up until right now is Slsa level 4. Okay. So the idea is the higher in level you go, the sort of the more trustworthy these things become. So fast forward, 5-10 years from now, an ideal state would be able to say these artifacts, these software binaries and things that people are getting off the internet or wherever, we can say, hey, this meets Slsa level 4, and have some sort of verification piece where we can actually, attest to those claims. And then it meets, and that would tell us that it meets these specific Slsa requirements that are outlined in the framework. So where the project is right now is we're trying to narrow down, those specific requirements. We're trying to get lots of feedback from lots of different use cases and talk to lots of different people and how they think about these things, what requirements are important for them. One challenge has been, like I said in the beginning, this was inspired by what we do internally at Google. Well, everyone kind of knows that Google's famous for this big mono repo and the way we build and distribute software. But the same doesn't always stand true for the open source. It's kind of how do you do 2-person review on an open source project that has 1 maintainer? So it's a challenge that kind of has come up, and things that we're trying to work through.
How do you vet the 2-person review? If it's external, or are you assuming they're doing the 2-person review and you're just trusting that? Or is it a 2-person external review of some sort that's validating?
Great.
Yeah.
Well, internally, I mean, two-person review is, when our engineers are writing code, someone else has to sign off, and do the code review and sign off on it. Of course, in the open source world and things, that gets much more difficult, and wanting to respect people's privacy and things, and make sure it's not a pseudo account sort of doing the review and writing the code and doing the sign off on it. So
yeah, that's where this is where I think trustworthiness it's an interesting, like looking for trust versus the word security. There's a big, like that's a big difference. Because in security, we're looking for a set of absolute rules or at least rules. Yeah. In trust, you're going with a different concept. And trustworthiness by nature, trustworthiness on the internet is a little sketchy to begin with, right? And
yep.
It's going to be interesting to see where this goes, because we've seen it in many breaches where, somewhere down the line, some module that somebody imported from one open source project maintained by one person, then got imported into another open source project, into another open source project, and made it into a commercial project. And nobody, it's so far down the line, nobody thinks about it. So it's like these Russian nesting dolls of scary, right? And is that what you're trying to solve, essentially?
I mean, that's part of it. It is a big, huge, problem, as you said. One of the topics that's come up in the Slsa framework is right now it's looking at the primary artifact and not going all the way down into transitive dependencies, even, because it sort of turtles all the way down.
Nice reference.
When you start looking at when you start looking at these problems, but I think usually at the end of the day, most developers sort of want to do the right thing. They want to use secure build systems to build their code, and they just, it's the time that it takes them to do the right thing, which is often difficult, because we're saying, not everyone thinks about security, and more time I have to spend on security things, the less time I can spend building this new shiny feature.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's sort of my hopes and dreams with a Slsa, the framework like Slsa, is be able to give these sort of tools and stuff to developers to be able to adopt these, good practices kind of out of the gate. When you say trust, I think there still has to be an element of trust somewhere. Like the build systems have to meet certain criteria, and then you sort of have to, trust that, they're doing what they're saying they're doing and doing things the right way.
How do you verify that? How do you verify with the different levels? Because I'm thinking of this from an NPM type of thing or something like that. I could see, hey, I'm going to get a repo, or, I'm going to pull this new component in, and, I can see it's this level. But how do you verify that somebody just didn't put I'm a 4 or, I'm a 3? Is that external auditing that happens there? Or is that go back to the trust of, we trust you?
That's a good question. I don't think we have all the answers yet, and it's definitely a conversation that needs to start happening within the community. I actually missed the last working group meeting, so it's possible that, these discussions have started. But I think a couple of things, we've talked about, kind of the source control systems and the build systems, having maybe a third party sort of audit them and say, yes, this source control system is capable of supporting an artifact to reach, Slsa 4, or, this build system. If I use this build system, I know that my, artifact can reach Slsa 4 or Slsa 3. So I think there will be some element of a third party sort of certification and audit system in it. I think, again, it'd be amazing if we ever got to a place where these things are completely automated, and then you can verify, and there's some sort of certification or conformance thing that you can say hey, if my artifact, if I can look at the build provenance and all these things, you pass these tests or something, then people would be able to see.
Is it something that brings with it a transparency requirement? So instead of having the third party auditing piece of, hey, look, here's all the stuff that's required, you have to have some sort of page with your repo that outlines, here's what you do, and, so much transparency around it that, maybe you can't validate it directly, but at least you're being super transparent to say, here's the stuff that we're doing. You can look at it and judge it. And, if we're lying about that, I mean, there's not a lot we can do, but hopefully with the transparency, that would be less.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so that's the whole provenance thing, and there's discussion about like the provenance format right now and what should actually be produced in those build outputs and what needs to be included, and so I think that's totally one big piece to it. There's another project that I work on that's not, it's decoupled from Slsa, but it actually touches into that kind of implementation detail about how you would do this transparent like provenance that you can later verify, and it's signed. SigStore is a project if you've come across that one. But exactly, there's a transparent log that sits. Anyone can query it. Anyone can look up the signature and then verify.
I can see it as like something that gets incorporated into a Git repo, right? Like a ranking or an assurance level. Because that's what essentially this is, an assurance level. Inside of any repository, and if it's not there, you should throw a flag or like, hey, wait a second. Does that make? Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, something like that. And I think at the end of the day, what organizations like even a Google or whatever want to be able to do is like all this, software you're not producing internally, like set up policies around these things. Like, hey, if a developer is going to introduce a new dependency, check the Slsa level. And if it doesn't meet Slsa level X, maybe the developer needs to take on more ownership or something of that package to mitigate against risk.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because as the security industry is pushing every day to make things across the enterprise space better. And as we do that, the focus, as we get the infrastructure more and more under control, legacy or cloud, the focus continues to be on software. And we saw that with, the SolarWinds pop, right, where we had somewhere downstream, software inserted into a repository, then got pushed up and suddenly became production code. That stuff is extremely difficult to, like, the question was, and I found this interesting. A bunch of my friends kept saying, during the CISO role, kept telling me that like all the boards are asking, like, okay, how do we prevent this from happening again? He's like, I can't go to every software manufacturer that I have here and say, show me artifacts, show me the evidence that you're not compromised. Like, that's impossible. Like, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're potentially providing, and through Slsa, that sort of, it's not an absolute, but it's going to give you some measure of tangible knowledge or something you can show somebody that says, look, we did our best. We found the thing, and it's at this level, and like, this is what the industry has. This is the best we can do right now.
Yeah, I mean, what Slsa is really trying to do is trying to say, from the beginning of writing the source code all the way to it's built into an artifact, we can tell you with guarantees that it was not tampered with. So what the developer intended to go into the code and the artifact is what sort of was put out.
So I like, that's an interesting way to put it. What the developer intended to go into the code, right?
I mean, that's one of the reasons actually, why I sort of backronymed it again into not being security level, because it's not actually saying anything, if that's good code or bad code. Right. It's just it's really that supply chain, the integrity of that supply chain piece.
That is interesting. James, this is kind of...
It's similar to what, I always say about, we talk about untrusted data in applications, and like, do you trust your data in SQL or your database, and it's like, I don't trust my data there, but I trust the integrity of my data there, right? I trust that what somebody put there is right. I just don't trust that it's not malicious. That's kind of that same thing, right? Like you're saying, hey, look, I trust what the developer meant to do is there. I'm not saying the developer didn't mean to do something insecure, or do something malicious with it. We're just saying that the process was properly followed, to this letter.
Is that?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and the build system is secure, right? I mean, that was the SolarWinds thing. Like you got to have some sort of guarantees on the build system that's building these things, and it's not doing anything malicious, and things aren't getting in there that shouldn't.
So this brings to mind, as you guys were talking, Jeremiah Grossman's been talking about this for forever. Software developer liability. This feels like it brings us a step closer, because if you can say this is what you put in the software, right? As a developer, you put this in. Nobody else inserted anything. Nobody else subtracted anything. Nobody else tampered with it. That makes you squarely liable for what's contained in this box. Am I going a step too far, or is that kind of the logical extension? James knows where I'm going with this.
I don't know. I haven't thought about that way, but
I don't know. I think that's still tough though, because if you still can't go down all the way of all the levels, you don't know what else is being inserted, right? Like I'm using this feature of this library. I don't know what's in that other piece.
You're right, but I can say, even if you just go one level down, I'm bringing in, say I'm writing some code for a webhook. I'm bringing in an open source library because I don't need to know how to write whatever the hell they did because I don't want to replicate the wheel. And they have a Slsa level, 4, if the top is assurance. If that is Trojaned or somehow broken, I bring it in and I can say, look, I brought this in. I don't have to go all the way down because if that's at level 4, I can hold that person that I got it from saying, look, you guys, this is your liability. And if they have downstream that they can point down, like I'm channeling this. I feel like Sean Tuma should be here. Like I'm channeling my inner Sean. I feel like I'm not a lawyer, but you guys see where I'm going with this? Because I can start.
Now you're just going to kill open source software. That's what you're going to kill.
I don't want to do that.
Let's not do that.
Yeah, let's not do that. But
right, because I wrote a piece and 500,000 other repos just pulled my little snippet of code in. And then, I'm not certified and it trickles back down to me. Like, nah, I'm not going to write that piece anymore. Now, granted, it was a padding piece and I should have written it myself anyway. But I had to go find a library for that,
I like to think of the other part of this too is where, one, I said like Slsa, even the highest level of Slsa right now doesn't cover all those dependencies. So that's something we actually need to work on within the framework is figure out like what sort of guarantees or what maybe we need to introduce a higher level that actually gets more into the dependencies that are pulled in. But I was going to say that, I think another big piece of this is companies just don't even know what they're running today. And they, you ask them what they're running in their production systems, they probably can't tell you. So I think that's the really interesting piece, where you have the provenance data and, everything that's sort of going into these builds is being able to then trace back. If something does go wrong, then you can actually trace things back to where they're running in production and then trace back to sort of where they came from and pinpoint, where these things are running your production servers, which I think is a huge issue today is when there is, a breach or an attack on some open source project or something, people have no idea if they're impacted or not.
Does this tie into there's so much talk about SBOM with the software bill of materials and all that. Like, how does that tie with it? Is this just a badge on that, to be oh, I've got my bill of materials and I can label each one as in a level of some sort?
Well, the way I've been thinking about how they're sort of related to is the SBOM is kind of more about what's in there, what's in the software and Slsa is more about the how and the why and the who. And so, I think they almost sort of need both. If you're given an SBOM, you need to make sure that it wasn't tampered with. You need to make sure that the integrity piece is there.
It sounds important.
So I do think, it'll be interesting to see how, some of the legislation comes out around the SBOM stuff.
I feel like we need to change the name of that because either maybe I'm just not pronouncing it right, but the number of times we just said bomb on this, just we might get flagged somewhere.
I didn't name that thing. I mean,
I know that was an executive order, so it came. Clear. Yeah.
SBOM.
BOM. There's no following B. Only one B.
Moment of silence for James as he gets black bagged and carted off.
That's why we're doing video now. So it's captured.
Right. The grab team gets into his room and woof, gone. So Kim, I think this is super important, and it was one of those things where I think it was necessary to happen because as we got that bill of materials, as we got the trust level in that bill of material. There may be a third component of the trifecta of this, which is the security assurance level of each of those components that say where they came from, how secure were they, and are they verifiable? How far did the turtles go, right? How many levels down? And at some point you have to, you hit an origin, right? There's, at some point you're imported from the C library. This is where it came from.
Yeah. There's another project. I know we're talking about Slsa, but there's another project that we started inside the open source security foundation called Security Scorecards. Okay. And so what that's doing is it's running through a number of security checks, like on the artifact itself. So it's like, was it scanned for vulnerabilities? You know, maybe that one actually doesn't exist yet, but like, is it being fuzzed? Are they doing PRs in the repo? Do they have branch protection turned on? So then I see that like security scorecard is like that, like you said, that security piece of an artifact itself. So it's another pretty cool project to check out.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back for me. It kind of comes back to how do we prevent another issue where somebody maliciously gains access, either through a compromise or through a sort of a trusted third party that they shouldn't be trusted. Inserts malicious code that's not necessarily a vulnerability, but like a piece of software that gets say it's inserted backdoor, because none of that's ever happened, into some piece of code. Mm-hmm. And how do we then track the origin of that, or where it first became a thing? And I think this is that step that we can say, this person didn't change it, this person doesn't change it, this person, okay, it was the import of the import of the import of the import. That's where it originated. So somewhere in that group, let's find out where it came from. At least it gives us maybe some forensic evidence at the issue. I mean, to where to go look.
Yeah. I mean, that's the part about the like verified provenance piece to it too. And that's where that other project comes in, that SigStore project. You know, if I'm a developer and I sign my artifact and you know, I'm signing everything that's the build history or the build script and everything that's in there, and then other developers can go verify that that's exactly, you know, the artifact that I intended to sign. And then you can actually monitor those logs. It's a transparency log for your own signature being for being stolen or something. So if you see something like show up in there that you didn't intend to sign, then you know somehow your key got compromised and someone else is signing on your behalf.
I think this absolutely puts another layer of spotlight on the code signing process, and the not necessarily from a security perspective, from an integrity perspective, right? The importance of signatures and code signing and ownership and all the things like keeping our certificate authorities safe, because that it's interesting, you know, like in the cloud, security eventually collapses down to the software, which further collapses all the way back into, you know, if we do everything else right, we have to get the signing authority, certificate authority becomes like the root of trust, ironically. Right. That's literally the definition of it. So it feels like we're going the right way here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm super excited about it. I know we chatted a little bit about it before the call, but I only have a couple weeks left at Google. Okay. And I'm going to go start a company around this stuff. That's awesome. So very similar space, but kind of realize, you know, everyone's got these problems right now with software supply chain security. And, you know, this kind of the spotlight is on. I think SolarWinds actually made this a whole new buzzword. Yeah. And sort of just realize, you know, what else is out there, and companies struggling to figure out how to protect themselves and things. So yeah, I am looking forward to helping this.
Well, supply chain,
more broadly.
Supply chain security suddenly overnight became the thing every board was asking their CISO about, and it's not that we never talked about it before, but it was one of those like, I mean, we've got other problems now. It's okay, all the other problems, and now this one's at the top. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the one that attackers have found is the, you know, easy way to get in with big, huge ramifications on the other side. You know, we kind of look at them like SolarWinds was like a 2-phase attack, right? They first had to get into the build system, and then the second phase is actually pushing out that malicious code to, you know, all these consumers. So, I think these attacks are getting scarier.
Well, if you do the job right and you're patient enough, you find a piece of software that's ubiquitous among thousands and thousands of companies that you want to get into that build system, get them to deploy it. And you don't necessarily have to hack your way into anything. You're there, right? You're an invited guest, whether anybody knows it or not.
Yeah, I think it's just driving like more awareness to the problem, you know, that your developers shouldn't be building these artifacts like under their desktop on, you know, insecure build system or something. And maybe your developers shouldn't be pulling in software dependencies that were built this way. I think but I think on the flip side, I used to be a developer before I came to Google, and I even studied security during my master's program, and it was never like, super top of mind for me. Again, I worked at like a couple of startups, and it was like, let's get the feature out the door. Like I didn't think about signing my code. And even if I did, it was
because that's not your job, right?
There was probably no easy. There's probably no easy way to do it.
This goes back to what is the effort of the developer geared toward? It's geared towards meeting the requirements, getting the product out the door in time with the intended requirements to those specifications, right? I used to work for HP, and for many years there was 2 questions: does it function, and does it perform? We eventually added, is it secure? But that went like a lead balloon because developers like, look, it works, it's fast. We'll worry about the security part of it later. Like, I need to get this code out. And I don't think that necessarily has changed in the 10 odd years since. Yeah. But again, this is not like developers are purposely trying to do something bad. It's just that they're doing their job. They're getting software out. We got to make it easier for them to look at. And I think trust levels will be, once we make it ubiquitous, like once it ends up in the Git repo, once it ends up in your IDE, once it ends up everywhere as part of some like certificate chain of trust for that piece of software, now you've got something. Because now exactly. You can actually use tools to verify that and go, yeah, that's cool, but that thing does not meet, essentially does not meet the criteria, and it's not what it says it is. That's a problem. Like, stop building this, right? Like, something we need to go investigate.
Yep. And I think that's what we're seeing now, or at least maybe me and my little bubble. And this is the stuff that I'm trying to work on, is actually like really make it easier for developers to adopt these secure practices. And, like I said, with Slsa, I think that would be like an amazing thing if, you're an open source developer and you're like, well, this is, my piece of software that I want to distribute out widely. And I would love to use this secure build system because, the more secure I can show that my practices and my workflows are, then maybe the more users or people I will get to use this thing. So, well,
on behalf of the security community and people that will want this, make it easier or easy-ish to implement, so that it's not one of those things that's a burden on developers, and it will be magical.
Yep. So. Yeah, like I know I keep mentioning the SigStore project, but there's a sub-project. It's sigstore.dev, by the way. There's a sub-project in there called cosign, which is for signing containers. And it's like literally a couple commands, from the command line. And they have this like keyless feature. So you don't have to worry about managing your own private keys and, all of the complexity that comes around with private key infrastructure and everything. There's a lot. So I think it's things like that. Yeah. I think it's projects like that are really going to shift the industry into having developers have this sort of secure by default mindset.
I think the example is there for a company like Google to set, because everybody says, well, it's great for a small developer. Look I'm a giant dev shop. And you go, well, if Google can do it, if Microsoft can do it, if Apple can do it, like, you have zero excuse, right? It's got, the bigger scale, I think is a good place to kind of birth this thing.
Yeah, I think you just reminded me of like another thing too. Like, yes, I mean, Google's huge. Lots of huge companies are on here too. But I think we all have to like keep ourselves in check, like in terms of like what threats we're defending against. So, one of the things in the Slsa framework is we try to list out all the different threats along the supply chain and like how a framework like Slsa could help.
That's awesome.
I think that. Yeah, I and like I said, I've only been working on security for real for the last year or so, but I think that's sort of a key to a lot of the security work in general, is like, if you don't tell people like what sort of threats, or what sort of real attacks have happened, like they're like, well, I don't need to waste my time doing this, what's the point? And I think that's like really key to a lot of this stuff, is tying it back. Like, look, we've seen this happen. Like, it's not made up in our heads. I think Sonatype just did a new report, and it's like 650% increase in supply chain attacks, I think, over the last year or something. So, I mean, these aren't really made up risk in people's heads, but I think making sure that you're not, you're defending against the most common types and things that we're seeing is important.
Well, and it's always good that you mentioned it. It's always good to know exactly what the purpose of the thing that you're trying to implement is. Otherwise, it becomes the magic button that solves everything. Yeah. And it's not, right? It's not meant to do that. You're not providing security. You're providing assurance levels, and that's that's a tremendous value. And I think there's a trifecta there that, like we said, that might be good. So, well, thank you for coming on and chatting with us about this, and good luck on the next endeavor. Maybe you'll come back and tell us about that.
Thanks. For sure.
And
awesome. Thanks for having me.
Before we go, can we get a guitar smash?
Oh my gosh.
She actually thought about it for a second.
People are like,
I know. It was close.
I don't even know like the brand or anything about it, and people ask me, I'm like, what are you talking?
It's probably like a $20 guitar. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's a $20. James just offered to pay him back for it if it's expensive.
It's like Jimi Hendrix signed or something, It's...
Yeah.
All right. Well, folks, that's it. Thanks for listening. This is super important, super informative. Kim, where do people go if they want to contribute or learn more or just figure out what's going on?
Yeah. So there's a site, slsa.dev, slsa.dev, and you can get to the GitHub repo from there. And we have community meetings, I think every other week on Wednesdays right now through the OpenSSF. So yeah. Come, feel free to check us out, give us feedback, contribute, all of the above.
Awesome.
Check out the logo too.
I'm going to have to go check out that logo.
It's pretty epic.
Awesome. Kim Lewandowski, thank you so much for joining us on the show. James, as always, appreciate your, this one's kind of in your wheelhouse too. So driving that software assurance, software security, baby. Oh, man. All right.
All right. Thanks, both.
Thanks. All right, folks. Thanks for listening. This has been yet another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raf signing off for us. We'll see you another time, another place on yet another Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Ciao, y'all.
As we fade out on another Down the Security Rabbit Hole episode, we'd like to encourage you to chat with our hosts and guests using the Twitter hashtag #DtSR. Please check out the show notes, catch up on any episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. So on behalf of Rafal, James, for now it's goodbye. We'll see you soon on another Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast.